So, yeah, this is a photo I took during the Black Summer fires as we were walking out from the Jagungal wilderness in the Snowy Mountains. And what you can see is cloud from the Duns Road fire coming towards us. This is a crown fire creating a pyrocumulonimbus cloud. So, yeah, I'll tell you a little bit more about that, but it's got some significance for us in this story. And particularly for this country, my background was working in the Snowy Mountains in the high country there. And it was where I was introduced by Uncle Rod Mason, in particular, a local Bermeringal elder from the area, who impressed on me a lot of his understanding of how to live with country. And it got me thinking. I worked in fire management at the time in 2003 when we had the huge alpine fires come through. And yeah, there's a lot that has come out of that kind of shaped my direction in going into fire modeling and looking at different ways of living in the landscape. See, in that high country there, Uncle Rod called it Tibilliga. There was it was an area that Aboriginal nations would come and meet in over the summer, and you had people coming from hundreds of kilometres in all directions, gathering together to spend several months in the high areas, and for important interactions between the different nations and important ways of cooperating with each other as well as with the landscape. And one of the things they used to do was to catch bogong moths. Now, one of the stories that has made its way into a lot of books about the high country comes from this quote by Townsend. Townsend was, as most would know, somebody who was surveying the area back in the 1840s, and we call him an explorer. He came to the area and found that his survey area was burnt, and he said that it was to do with the First Nations up there collecting bogong moths. And he said that to obtain them, they light large fires, and the consequence was the country throughout the whole survey was burnt. Now, that has made its way into numerous books and a widespread understanding that there was widespread burning by First Nations to catch moths. Now, first-hand observations of moth catching showed that what they actually did was the moths would congregate in little caves in the granite tors, and the hunters there would go and throw down a skin or some bark underneath the moths and wave a burning branch over them. The moths would fall onto the bark or the skin, they'd pull them out and they'd cook them. So they used fire, but in a controlled and well thought through way that makes sense. What we've gone with culturally is this idea that all of these nations would gather from hundreds of kilometers around and then light bushfires all around themselves and burn the whole Snowy Mountains area to catch these moths, which makes absolutely no sense. But it's the only way that we can come to this idea that they burnt the area the whole time. You'll notice from this quote from Townsend that he didn't see them doing it. He just assumed that the burnt country was a result of First Nations burning it. This is really typical of the way that we understand Aboriginal burning in Australia. We take this assumption that because they used fire, they must have burnt the country the whole time. And what we're actually doing is imposing a European concept of management, where the early graziers that came into the area took their management of the moors, which were managed with fire, and applied it to the mountains here. So that's where I want to start from, this great contrast between traditional Aboriginal burning, which was very fine scale, very focused, very purposeful, contrasted with our European concepts of burning, which were basically to clear country and to change it and subdue it so that we could graze the animals we wanted to graze. Now, out of that, we've developed a concept of what drives bushfires. We talk about fuels. Constantly, when there's a bushfire, you will always have somebody saying that it's because the fuel loads were too high, the bushfire went wild. And we get that idea from things like campfires. If you want a bigger fire, you put more fuel on the fire and it makes the flames bigger. A bushfire is a bit more complex than a campfire, though. Now, back in the 60s, in 1967, a fellow called Alan MacArthur published this graph in a leaflet. And he showed from these 9 data points, he argued that if you double the weight of fuel, the leaf litter on the ground, then you double the rate that fire spreads. Now, this was, as I say, a leaflet. It never was peer reviewed. And in fact, MacArthur said at the time that it was effectively a back of the envelope calculation. It was may well be proved completely wrong. But we have taken that very, very simplistic back of the envelope model and made it the basis for our fire management in Australia. So we have this understanding that to reduce bushfire intensity, severity, we need to reduce the fuel load. What actually happens? Well, since I saw just how badly that model predicted the fires in 2003, I devoted my time to trying to develop a better understanding of fire behaviour. And what I found was that if you looked at just the fuel load on the ground, using a properly scientifically developed model of fire behaviour for fuel loads, it showed that you always get small flames when it's just burning leaf litter. You could see this yourself. You could throw out dried leaf litter as much as you like on an empty car park or something like that, set it on fire, and you'll only get small flames. What gives you big flames is if the plants ignite. So the question is, will they ignite, and how will they burn if they do ignite? How does flame cross those gaps between plants? So there's a lot of factors in there. There's leaf traits that make plants more or less flammable. And then there's also the spacing between plants and how difficult it is for flames to cross those gaps. So I've combined all of those ideas mathematically into a model, and it's got a lot of implications for how we manage forests, because the issue here is not now about a load of dead leaves increasing over time. It's about managing plants. I'm currently studying a forest in southwestern Australia, and we've surveyed across a wide range of ages there. And if we look from left to right here, we see the forest aging. On the left, there are trees that have been scorched by a prescribed burn. There's epicormic growth the whole way up the trees. As the forest ages, the shrubs that were burnt away start to come back. They grow back very thick and increasingly tall. But around that sort of 25, 30 year mark, you start seeing a bit of a change in there. And so that by the time you get to, say, 75 years or 100 years, the lower plants have thinned out and the taller plants remain. The taller plants have a role of slowing the wind speed so that it's more of a still microclimate on the ground. But if they're tall enough, then they don't ignite, they don't become fuels. Now, what it looks like is that forest is on a hill, but that's actually a graph of the average flame height that I modeled using my fire behavior model, which is called FRAME, the Fire Research and Modeling Environment. Modeled the flame height for bushfire conditions as that forest aged. And as you can see, at around 25 or 30 years, when the shrubs are tallest and most dense, is when you get the biggest flames. And as that forest ages past that, you start getting smaller flames. Now, these are not just processes unique to southwestern Australia. These are fundamentals of forest ecology that occur around the world. Things like self-thinning, self-pruning as leaves are shaded out by taller plants. They're no longer any use to the plant, so the plant drops them and it drops its lower branches, and the base heights of plants become higher, so that they're more out of reach of the flames. The dead litter on the ground rots away over time. It's not constantly building up. And so you get this more open understory at the ground, and that results in smaller flames. These are what I call the ecological controls on fire. They're the ways that forests have effectively dealt with fire for the many, many millions of years before there were people around. And that's the weird situation for many of us. People don't appreciate the fact that forests actually survived before there were people to cut them down and burn them and save them from themselves. So we have this concept that the bush needs us, and yet in reality it has these controls and these processes that make it survive without us stepping in. But people will say that's just a model. Here's what I measured across the Alps, across Victoria, New South Wales and the ACT. Didn't matter whether I was looking at subalpine forests or tall wet forests or low dry forests in the Snowy River Valley, all showed this same pattern where after fire you had increased likelihood of crown fire, increased likelihood of any fire. But then as those forests aged, they self-thinned and they cleared out, and the likelihood of fire and severe fire disappeared dramatically. It didn't mean that they couldn't burn, but it was just much less likely. And so we have this trend based on what has actually happened. It's not theoretical, it's what I've measured throughout the history of these forests. Self-thinning, self-pruning, these ecological controls are real things. They're not a theoretical thing. It's what we see across forests. Now, the next argument against that from many people is that, well, you only get this dense shrub growth if you have severe fire. What we've got in this situation is an alpine ash forest with a low severity prescribed fire on the left-hand side of the road that was carried out 12 years ago. And on the right-hand side of the road, the forest was left to age for until it's about 38 years old. So the general state of thought that people have held for a long time is that a low intensity fire can't germinate those shrubs. You need high intensity fire to do that. Now, frame is also something that I can use to model heat penetration into the ground. And when I did that for this forest and for prescribed burning conditions, what I found was that you were able to germinate shrubs down to about 5 centimeters into the soil. You could break seed dormancy 5 centimeters into the soil. Each line on this graph shows the temperature over time at a different depth. And if the line crosses into that brown area, then it's the right temperature to break the dormancy of those seeds. So we can expect from basic principles of physics that we would germinate these shrubs here, even with a low intensity fire. And indeed, that's exactly what has happened. What difference does that make? Well, if we look at this burn treatment on the left, I grew up in a religious tradition where we were taught we needed to subdue the earth, and it's thinking that comes out of the Fertile Crescent, out of the agricultural revolution. It's the kind of thinking that motivates our Western thought. We say that management means actively intervening and actively changing things. So that's what's happened on the left-hand side of the road. We've stepped in, we've subdued the forest, and as a result, we've germinated all of these shrubs. Now, the fire that burnt to the edge of this forest in January 2020 looked at those conditions and looked at what would have happened if it had burnt in. If it had burnt the left-hand side of the road, we would have had flames that were about 3 meters high, the median flame height. We would have been able to aggressively fight those fires about 2/3 of the time, but about 1/3 of the time, we would have needed to fall back to back burning. On the right-hand side of the road, if we had cooperated with the ecological controls and allowed it to age, we would have had a median flame height of about 1 meter, and we could have aggressively fought fires the whole time. So we have this idea that management means we have to do something. If we say burning causes all of this regrowth, the response from some is well, what do you want to do? Just do nothing. But it's not just doing nothing, it's a different mentality. It's allowing the ecological controls to continue on as they were going to without our intervention. The other implication of this is for the survival of these ash trees themselves, because if they get more than 50% scorch, the trees are killed. They'll regrow from seed, but then if they're burned again within that roughly 20-year period, you lose those trees for good. And we are losing ash forests this way over time. If a fire had come through on the left-hand side of the road, we can see that it would have scorched those forests a lot of the time. But if it had come through on the right-hand side of the road, then there would have been very little crown scorch. So we're back to this scene walking out along the Round Mountain Fire Trail. This is my partner Bronnie walking in front of me. We're walking as fast as we can because the smoke from the Duns Road fire is burning directly towards us. We have to get to the other side of that mountain to where the car's parked before the fire does. This is not a bad fire day for this area. This is an average summer day. There's not strong wind, it's not very hot, but this is a crown fire. And the reason there is a crown fire is because it's regrowth from logging just to the west of Kosciuszko National Park. It's spreading incredibly quickly through those logged forests. We made it to the car. I hope I don't spoil that surprise, but we got there. There were embers falling. The roads were closed. It was dark, but we got out of that area. And it impressed again on me the scale of the impact that our interventions can have. That as we step in and try and save forests from themselves, we set in motion a whole lot of different processes because we're interrupting these ecological controls. There is a different way of thinking. The First Nations took an approach that they weren't there to subdue the earth. They were there to live with the other species, to have kinship. Bagal, Uncle Rod would call it. You have Bagal with different species where you looked out for them and you were responsible for them. And you took no more than what was your fair share. Instead of burning a whole mountain range, you would burn a little patch here and there as you needed to, as you traveled along your travel routes there. You'd burn small areas, you'd attract game to those areas, you'd regenerate food shrubs in those areas. And as a result, the wider landscape was left to age with those ecological controls, but your travel routes were surrounded by your small-scale interventions. In the same way as every other species changes the world around it in its own small way, our First Nations learnt that if you don't take more than you need and you instead cooperate with the other lives there, you can hang around for 65,000 years.